Hello. Thank you guys for joining me today. In this episode of the Theological Beer Study, we're going to be taking a look at Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And this is the beginning. And we're going to be pairing it with a Guinness. Isn't that just a beautiful beer? Now, okay, the reason we're going to be pairing it with Guinness is because it's rather a brilliant beginner's beer. If all you know about beer is Bud Miller Coors, one of my main goals in life is to get people away from that and into the broader spectrum of beer. The better beer, the good beer, the way beer should be. And always a good starting point with that is a Guinness. Why? Because it's everywhere. All over the world, in just about every bar, just about every pub, just about every restaurant. It's everywhere. So it's easy to get. Now to the beginner, this looks dark and scary, but it's got about as many calories and carbs as the Bud Miller Coors lineup. It's actually really light. That's why if you mix it with any other beers, it floats. So if you want to go deeper with your beer knowledge and expand your palate, I'd say Guinness is a great start. That's great. Now, likewise, if you want to deepen your theology and expand your relationship with Jesus, a good place to start is Genesis, beginning of the Bible. It's the beginning. This is the start. So I've got 3 points for us today. And the first one, in the beginning, well, when was that exactly? You'll notice in Genesis 1, verse 1, it says, in the beginning. Okay, great. When was that? To have a better understanding of the Bible, it really all starts right here. We have to have a good idea of what this means and when this was. And to understand that properly, you have to know that God's timing is different than ours. Now, there's a lot of theories on what a day means in these first couple of chapters of Genesis. Some say that it was a very literal one day, a 24-hour period, and that's all fine and good. Others say, well, it could have been thousands of years. And there's some other wacky theories out there as well. Now, the benefit of believing that it was actually a 24-hour period, one day means one day as we know it today, is that would actually strengthen our faith in God. To say that a day means something else than a day might kind of make the Bible a little hogwashy or a little wishy-washy. If it says it's a day, hey, it's a day. Others believe that a day means a period of time. And for me personally, when I lean up on that side, that's kind of interesting because it's not until the fourth day, verses 14 through 19 of chapter 1, where God actually creates the 24-hour day period as we know it. So it is very possible that a day may not mean a day as we know it today. But the main thing to understand is that God's timing is different than ours. I'll give you 2 things to get a good glimpse on how God's timing is different than ours. The first easy way to explain it would be the number line. And I'll see if I can put this on the screen here. Okay, in the middle you have the 0, right? And then we know that numbers count up 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity, right? And that's how we think. But also from our starting point, we have numbers that go backwards. That's -1, -2, and -3 to infinity. So you got numbers going positive and backwards. And we like to think that time is always going in our direction. The first day of the month, after that comes the second day of the month. But here in Genesis, we see that is something that God created for us to organize our lives. But there is another spectrum that goes backwards, the other way, that God understands that we can't really fathom. The second interesting way to look at it comes from C.S. Lewis, when he told a story about an author. Now, this author was writing a book, and the character in the book was sitting at the table, and while they're sitting at the table having lunch or whatever, they heard a knock at the door. Now, the time it takes for that character in the book to walk to the door, only a few seconds. But what you don't realize is that the author writing the story took a break, went out, had some lunch, talked to a few people, ran other errands, and then came back and finished writing that story. So for the character in the book, it was just a couple of seconds. But the author had a lot of time to think about that character and to think about what was going to happen. Now, the author even knew who was at the door. Now, of course, C.S. Lewis tells that story much better than I ever would. You can find C.S. Lewis telling that story if you search in YouTube for C.S. Lewis's surviving BBC radio address. Moving on to part 2, we get what was there, but who was there? Now, in this section, I want to help you understand verse 26 of chapter 1. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image." Who's he talking to? Let us make man? Well, let's go back to the beginning, and we'll see that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. I'm reading from the ESV version in case you're wondering. And darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. So we have in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then also there's the Spirit of God that was hovering over the face of the waters that he had just created. So in the English translated, it doesn't really pop out at you, but this kind of introduces a dimension of God that we don't always think about. And really what this is the Holy Spirit. So here we have God and God the Holy Spirit. In addition, let's jump to the New Testament, the Gospel according to John. Now, John was one of the disciples. He was actually Jesus' best friend, okay? So here we find that John starts his Gospel just like Genesis. In the beginning was the Word. Okay, so what's the Word? And the Word was with God. Well, here in Genesis, we see that in the beginning, God, okay, so we've got God. It doesn't say anything about the Word back here, but John reveals to us that the Word was with God. So who was the Word? If you read through the rest of the Gospel of John, you'll find that the Word was actually Jesus. Jesus was there. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's awesome. So back to what this means in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image. Let us make man in our own image. He's talking. That's God the Father talking to the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit communicating with Jesus. This is the Trinity. This is God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They're all right there. They have always been there, and they always will be there. This is fascinating stuff, and this will help you have a better understanding as you read the rest of the Bible, the whole thing, because Jesus is the hero. Okay, God is always the hero. The rest of the people in the Bible are just people that God uses. They're all horrible people. They're not heroes. Jesus is the hero because he's able to grab our hearts and do amazing things with us. Like David, for example, he's looked at as one of the greats, the greatest king of Israel. But what do we see when we read the Bible? He's a total screw up. He steals another man's wife and has the guy killed. Okay? That's not a hero. Right? Jesus is. God is the hero because God gets a hold of his hearts and David repents, turns around. And that's why David then becomes great. So let's go on to the last thing I want to pull out before we wrap this up. Before the fall is how God intended life to be. Okay, let me explain this. These two chapters are so important because they show how God intended life to be for us. It shows how he intended for us to live. And really what this does is it answers the tough question, why do bad things happen to good people? Okay? Well, the answer to that is, well, God never intended that. We have to get our minds out of the rut. When something bad happens, we want to blame God. We want to say that if God was so big, why didn't he change this outcome? Why didn't he do this differently? Why would he allow such evil to happen in the world today? Well, the truth is, God never meant for it to happen. As you get into the story of the fall, that's chapter 3 in Genesis, we'll begin to see how God is dealing with evil, okay? So yes, the evil is a part of our world now, but it was never what God intended, and God is doing something about it. He's a good God. For me, it helps shed a little light on why bad things happen to good people, and similar questions like that. So I hope that these 3 things will help you move forward. By having a good understanding of the beginning, these first 2 chapters in Genesis, I hope that you'll have a better understanding and a more accurate understanding of the Bible's teachings as you move forward and continue reading. All right, thanks guys, and cheers.